Buonasera a tutti e grazie di essere venuti. Questa è la nostra 10ª conferenza Genesis, un bel numero. E, abbiamo oggi l'architetto Andy Groarke dello studio Carmody Groarke da Londra, che ci farà una presentazione che ha preparato apposta per noi. E, lascio la parola alla professoressa Lina Malfona, che vi introdurrà il lavoro dell'architetto, e poi all'architetto Andy Groarke.
Buonasera, è con grande piacere che vi presento lo studio Carmody Groarke. Però prima di farlo vorrei ringraziare il gruppo Genesis che ha, diciamo, con grandissimo entusiasmo, devo dire, ormai anche con una certa perizia, diciamo, organizzativa, si interessa della promozione dell'architettura, diciamo anche di alto profilo qui a Pisa, quindi ringrazio il gruppo Genesis. Non voglio dire troppo perché, come dire, non vorrei che scopriste pian piano il lavoro e soprattutto la straordinaria varietà dei progetti di questo studio. Intanto Kevin Carmody e Andy Groarke vivono e lavorano a Londra, dove fondano il loro studio nel 2006, uno studio che ha ormai raggiunto, diciamo, un riconoscimento nazionale ma anche come dire, internazionale, progettando e realizzando edifici residenziali, edifici per diciamo, la cultura e per le arti. Tra i loro progetti cito, ecco, la nuova galleria d'architettura presso il Royal Institute of British Architects e la Members Room presso il Victoria and Albert Museum, tutti a Londra. Ma ci sono anche dei progetti che attualmente sono in corso di realizzazione, come l'ampliamento del Museo della Scienza e dell'Industria a Manchester, che arricchiscono, diciamo, una produzione che è già molto consolidata. Inoltre, insomma, altri progetti probabilmente più conosciuti, la casa ad Highgate, la casa in mattoni ad Highgate e i padiglioni residenziali nel bosco. Tra l'altro dico e vi trasferisco questa informazione che appunto Andy Groarke mi ha appena suggerito. Il loro lavoro verrà pubblicato, sta per essere pubblicato sul numero di El Croquis, e inoltre hanno appena iniziato a lavorare ad un progetto di residenze per studenti a Milano, quindi in Italia. Come dire, non può in qualche modo non sorprendere il fatto che degli architetti così giovani abbiano realizzato, costruito, progettato una mole, diciamo, enorme di progetti, di lavori, anche progetti, come dire, premiati, riconosciuti a livello internazionale. Il progetto, per esempio, di rigenerazione urbana per l'area di Rectory Farm, vicino all'aeroporto di Heathrow, Londra, è stato di recente pubblicato su Architectural Review, così come il progetto per il memoriale dei bombardamenti del 7 luglio ha vinto un importante award del Royal Institute of British Architects. Quindi questo è per presentarvi diciamo, questo studio. Detto questo, diciamo, quello che mi interessa sottolineare sono alcuni aspetti, un paio di aspetti del loro lavoro, prima di passare appunto la parola ad Andy Groarke, e un paio di aspetti legati, diciamo, alla loro pratica progettuale, alla loro pratica compositiva. Un primo aspetto è quello che, diciamo, può essere definito come l'ossessione per la possibilità. I grandi maestri del passato ci hanno insegnato, soprattutto in Italia, ad avere delle ossessioni, no? E in qualche modo Aldo Rossi, l'architettura di Aldo Rossi, l'architettura di Paolo Portoghesi sono delle architetture che, come dire, utilizzano spesso lo stesso lessico. È come se quasi questi maestri facessero sempre lo stesso progetto, no? Quindi attraverso, diventando riconoscibili attraverso un'impronta, una sorta di linguaggio, quasi attraverso una pratica ossessivo-compulsiva, come dire, in cui appunto viene sempre ripetuto lo stesso stile. Invece lo studio Carmody Groarke ha, secondo me, un po' ribaltato questa ossessione, diciamo, per l'autorialità del segno a favore di un'ossessione per la possibilità, cioè per un modo di progettare che sia sempre diverso e che non corra mai il rischio di incorrere nella cristallizzazione dello stile, diciamo nella monumentalizzazione del linguaggio. È uno studio che scommette molto non solo sulla novità, ma proprio appunto su questo diciamo acceso sperimentalismo, che diventa anche in qualche modo un'ossessione inversa, perché è l'ossessione per la ricerca, diciamo, di quella possibilità che ancora non è stata esplorata. Quindi per questo, diciamo, questo è una prima nota, è un primo aspetto da sottolineare. Un aspetto che si pone in qualche modo in continuità con un secondo aspetto che si può appunto notare nel loro lavoro e che è legato al conflitto che è tutto interno al loro modo di progettare tra la temporaneità e la permanenza. Questo mi sembra un punto abbastanza interessante, perché è come se questo studio lavorasse su strutture temporanee però attraverso delle idee permanenti. Infatti molti di questi progetti che vedremo, che oggi ci esporrà, sono diciamo quasi delle performance, quasi degli spettacoli effimeri, no? Degli spettacoli effimeri che però riescono a dare in qualche modo un'impronta di permanenza. Per esempio io pensavo al ristorante sul tetto di un parcheggio multipiano a Londra, che appunto da lontano sembra un edificio duraturo, stabile, poi invece quando ci si entra dentro si scopre che è una struttura temporanea, quindi flessibile, che è connaturata in qualche modo al concetto di padiglione, alla magia quasi dell'allestimento. Un altro aspetto che voglio sottolineare è il fatto che questi architetti, credo che anziché formulare un lessico, quindi anziché inventare qualcosa di nuovo, lavorano sulle relazioni e quindi creano sintassi, creano diciamo, relazioni appunto tra gli oggetti, tra i corpi architettonici. Quello che emerge infatti in questo studio è questa sapienza nel, diciamo, tenere insieme alcuni aspetti compositivi, cioè quasi la loro abilità come placemakers, come creatori appunto di luoghi, quindi di spazi che sono quasi sempre organizzati poi attraverso, diciamo, delle strutture abbastanza irregolari, cioè sono sempre degli spazi raccolti attorno a delle strutture irregolari, e quindi anche la preferenza per un certo tipo di operazioni compositive che spesso sono la giustapposizione dei volumi, la rotazione, diciamo, degli oggetti, a formare dei cluster, lavorando proprio su quello che si potrebbe dire essere appunto il tema della collezione, cioè la collezione di oggetti d'arte, così come la collezione di pezzi preziosi, di architetture, nel caso di Carmody Groarke straordinariamente raffinate, lo vedrete. Un ulteriore aspetto è il loro legame molto forte con l'ingegneria e la loro fiducia nell'ingegneria, quindi negli ingegneri come creatori delle loro visioni, quindi il lavoro per esempio fatto su alcuni padiglioni che sfidano la forza del vento. E inoltre, per concludere, diciamo, io mi sono interrogata un po' su quali potessero essere gli aspetti ricorrenti della progettazione di Carmody Groarke, forse anche per una sorta di deformazione professionale che è quella un po' degli storici e dei critici dell'architettura che cercano di individuare un fil rouge nell'attività appunto di un progettista. Credo che, almeno dal mio punto di vista, penso che il tema, diciamo, che in qualche modo costruisce delle relazioni, il tema che è al centro della loro architettura è il tema del padiglione, perché appunto ognuna di queste architetture che oggi vedrete può essere considerata un'architettura temporanea e allo stesso tempo un'architettura permanente, quindi un padiglione, appunto una riproposizione contemporanea dell'archetipo della capanna primitiva e in qualche modo anche una manifestazione di quella volontà di cercare di volta in volta, di progetto in progetto, diciamo, l'origine dell'architettura, quindi nonostante tutto, nonostante questa grande varietà, appunto di cercare i punti fermi dell'architettura. Vi ringrazio e passo la parola a Andy Groarke.
Well, first of all, thank you very much for the introduction. Thank you to the university and the sponsors for inviting me here this evening, and thank you to you all for coming to hear a talk on such a beautiful sunny Friday evening. In response to the invitation for the Genesis series, we've entitled the talk Making Prototypes. I think it somehow is thematically linked to a certain interest in physical processes, the kind of the analog involvement of staying close to the craft of our of architecture, and an acknowledgement that really we're making a series of kind of one-off projects, one after another, and somehow trying to draw some red thread in situations like this between those opportunities. I'm going to begin with an image that we use a lot as a touchstone for the practice. I'm going to begin with this, which is a real touchstone for the practice. This is London. It's 1919. It's just after the First World War. This is Sir Edwin Lutyens, a famous London architect, walking away from possibly the most famous memorial in the British Isles. It's the memorial to the Great War, the 1 million dead, and for me it raises an incredible paradox in this image and a series of themes which I find incredibly interesting. That paradox is that whilst we're looking at this memorial, it is in fact a plaster and plywood mock-up, and was there to test an expectant need for architecture. 1 year after the installation of this temporary memorial, a permanent memorial was unveiled and still exists today as the most important kind of nexus for people making sense of their times and making rituals from celebrating those that laid down their lives in the Great War. I think that there's a number of ingredients in this image that, beyond the temporary nature, the assumed permanence of this project, there's also the architect that walks away from the work once it's delivered and somehow left with the constituency of the work, the people, the visitors, the people that are trying to make sense of this work, left to ponder its meaning, and notwithstanding the fact that this is a temporary installation, I think that the being in the physical presence of architecture, trusting in the physical presence of architecture, whether it be temporary or permanent, is such a powerful message. This is our studio in London, in Covent Garden. As you can see, there's a mixture of projects, models, photographs, prototypes, samples, materials, and this is how the studio looks today. We really enjoy the fact that projects can kind of cross-reference one another, and that they become part of this kind of continuum or red thread of design knowledge that we build up, having had a practice of 12 years. But really, those projects really do influence one another, whether they're places to live, places to visit, or places to learn, or places to work. And so what I've tried to do in this talk is to put together a cross-section of some of the ways in which the practice works in London. 4 thematic chapters which are loosely based around projects, but looking at how projects affect one another in a design process. So the first project really, probably one of the most profound experiences that we've had as working as architects, having an office, is when we were invited to design a permanent memorial ourselves for the victims, the 52 lives lost on 7th of July 2005 when 4 bombs were detonated. Terrorist bombs were detonated in London early in the morning. The first memorialization of this event is not physical, it's in the realm of images, although because those events were disparate, they were spread apart. There are 4 separate locations of the bombs. There was an Act of Parliament that deemed it necessary to have a physical place of remembrance in one of the biggest parks in London, Hyde Park, so that people could come together, rather like Lutyens' cenotaph, come together and make sense of their times together, rather than just through making sense of images remotely. Now, of course, when we first took on this commission as young architects, we really grappled, it really vexed us what this memorial was going to become, because we looked at the kind of modern history of memorials and those architects and artists and designers who had represented memorialization, the physical memorialization of the events so very well, and we thought, well, it would be, you know, the legacy of memorializing heroicism in conflict has very, very redolent imagery that can be brought to mind. Latterly, there have been memorials to depict the effects of natural disasters, but we're talking about a civilian disaster where 52 innocent people lost their lives for a very confusing reason. Their lives were taken by 4 terrorist bombers. And so the identity of this memorial wasn't immediately obvious to us. As architects, we'd never done a project like this before. We always had clients that wanted to be clients. In this case, our clients didn't want to be clients. They were reluctantly there on behalf of their loved ones. And so we had a very, very unique design challenge on our hands. This is the plaque that commemorates the 52 lives lost, but it's only one part of the memorial. We won the project in competition against 8 artists who produced a figurative proposal, and we proposed in an interview that we would simply listen to the families' needs, the delegates of the bereaved families, and give them a very architectural process, one that we knew, one that we made a conciliation of a client's brief and issues of site, and somehow brought those together in a formal, a physical identity of the memorial. So we were given this site, and this is Hyde Park. This is in central London. This is, as many of you know, is Mayfair. This is Park Lane, and this is Hyde Park, which is a royal hunting ground dating back to Henry VIII times, where paths crisscross from edge to edge. Excuse me. And the character of the park is just like this. And we said, well, we should find this very, very special place where only one of these paths that didn't meet the very edge of the perimeter of the park. It was cut short when Park Lane was extended in the 1960s. And we should find a very, very poignant, special place. So through a very architectural investigation, working with our clients, the families, we examined the issues of place. And I think I'd now like to kind of bring in within the kind of main project, a project that we were doing concurrently with an artist. We only had a practice for 18 months when we won this commission. And we were very, very fortunate to work with some incredibly interesting and creative collaborators. And this was for a sculptor, Anthony Gormley, to design a pavilion with him that was full of freezing cold fog. Now, you might wonder why I'm making a connection between these two commissions. Well, really, this project although we can't claim artistic identity for this project ourselves, this is Anthony Gormley's genesis, this is his work. We were architects in the service of delivery of this project, but we learnt some incredibly important lessons about how people behave around this piece of abstract architecture, how people observe one another in a cultural experience, in an exhibition, in a public space, and how there is both a singular, an individual experience of this work, but there's a collective making sense of this work. The work makes sense when the presence of the visitor is both inside the pavilion and outside the pavilion. There's a fundamental architectural tension between those two conditions of the view and the viewed, and also you're very, very conscious of one another when you're in this piece of work. When you're in the fog pavilion, you lose all sense of your Cartesian coordinates of space, and you're more aware of your body because you simply can't see very much else besides. So there's this recognition of the person within this abstract piece of architecture that really propelled us into conversations with the bereaved families about how to commemorate a single life lost and the collective effect on society as a whole. And that very, very quickly galvanized into kind of some abstract physical form. I mean, bearing in mind, as architects, when we're given commissions, they usually have kind of some of the functions of conventional architecture, like comfort or shelter or enclosure. This had none of those ingredients, and yet somehow we were, as architects, deriving an architectural project out of abstract architectural form. And so the language of the architecture quickly emerged from this kind of parallel project that we had done working with Anthony Gormley. And so the one and the many became the language of this piece of work. So each life lost is represented by a single 1-ton ingot of stainless steel, and they're arranged into 1, 2, 3, 4 clusters, which represent the numbers of lives lost in each bomb, blended in an architectural arrangement that the visitor explores. And then we were charged with having to make architectural form with material. What was the meaning of the making? And we after much form finding, materials research, we elected to use a very unexpected material. We used stainless steel, a material that's normally used in a very commercial environment. It's a material you associate with the city, but not in the way that we used it. We used it in a very archaic technique of pressing a wooden former into a box of chromite sand and then poured 1 ton of molten stainless steel into the form. So one wooden former pressed 52 times made 52 stainless steel 1-ton stelae. Now, because of the volatility of the way that this steel took its form at 1600 degrees centigrade in only 6 seconds, and then took 24 hours to cool, you got the most incredible, quite unexpected forms. The foundry that we worked with at great length was rather surprised. You can see in the background some of the precision engineering pieces, which were engineering perfect using stainless steel. These were deliberately imperfect, and the foundry was concerned that this would cause them reputational harm And we said, this is exactly what we want. We want one thing making 52 things. We want the singular and the collective embedded in this meaning of making, but we want these things to be subtly different. And when they're mounted in the park, they come in and out of focus in terms of whether they're a single form or whether there's kind of several forms. It's a very, very dynamic effect in the park. And these 100 by 150 by 150 squares that are placed a metre apart in a grid where the visitor can wander create this kind of sequence where the path ends prematurely before it reaches the end of the park, and on a berm, a raised piece of land, rests a plaque with the 52 names. On each stelae was an inscription documenting simple raw facts, arranged like you would arrange text on the spine of an English book, reading vertically down, and borrowing some of the very, very beautiful sans serif fonts of the London Underground. So there was a cultural reference fused into the surface of these stelae. So that each and every piece of this sculptural ensemble was somehow the same, but ever so slightly different by their own casting processes. And I think what this project taught us is really about the importance of the meaning of making, about the importance of having the presence of the visitor within the piece of architecture, completing the message. The presence of the living amongst those things that represent the dead give more poignancy to the message of the memorial. And that you can see that actually these are, in my opinion, rather beautiful because they're not engineering perfect. They have their own idiosyncrasies and differences, and that they're each, in a sense, a prototype. This is a cluster of 52 prototypes which took on their own form because of a very archaic, unique metal casting process. And then what is really interesting to us as architects is, rather like Sir Edwin Lutyens wandering away from his piece of work, you can't really altogether predict how people are going to behave when they get here, how they're going to make the purpose of this piece of work is, in fact, the only purpose of this piece of work, its only function is to stop people forgetting. So it's, in a sense, it's a physical place for people to come together and make sense of their times, and that's that. And people make sense of their times in altogether different ways, either individually, collectively, ceremonially, and sometimes rather surprisingly register their views and opinions according to this event in really kind of unexpected ways. So I think what's taught us a huge lesson in this project is how architecture, you can't really kind of predict how it's used or misused, and how it may be tagged with Islamic fundamentalist graffiti, and to a certain extent that's an interesting cultural registration of other people making sense of their times, and yet sometimes this memorial in its ceremony, in its event, is foreground, but often it's part of people's background to their park. And this is a piece that just exists as an architectural proportioning work beneath the heavy laden canopies of the 7th of July park. The next project is a really rather wonderful opportunity for our studio. It's our first permanent museum, if anything can be called truly permanent. This notion of time scale, this notion of time is a concurrent theme in the practices, research and investigation. And so I'd prefer to use the term more long-lasting project. The project is for a steamboat museum on Lake Windermere to take care of an internationally important collection. Now, Lake Windermere is in the Lake District National Park, which is in the north of the UK. This is the Scots border around here, Manchester, Leeds. And it used to be a sort of a recreational place of sorts for wealthy industrialists of the 19th century who came up to lakes like this and had wonderful kind of recreational boatcraft on the lake, steamboats. Our site is halfway up Lake Windermere on the east shore, and it has the most incredible aspect. And it's got a really incredible history, Windermere as a lake. It's the longest man-made lake in the UK. It has the wettest climate in terms of rainfall in the UK. But it has this incredible picturesque tradition of literature and fine art, this Turner watercolour of the landscape. But it also has this working tradition, the lake. And in fact, our site was originally the site of a gravel extraction plant. So we have this conundrum, really, what to represent in the architectural idea. Is it the picturesque? Is it the pretty? Or is it the raw and industrial? And we think that if architecture is to behave as some kind of authentic continuum of a place, it somehow has to acknowledge both of those histories and place them in equal emphasis. This is the Steamboat Museum as we found it, as we photographed it on the first day when we went to visit it in the competition. These are timber sheds that are literally falling down. The jetties are falling into the water. The boats, which last longest when they're on the water, are at risk of structures falling in on top of them. But there was an incredible apprenticeship program. There's an incredible conservation program around the Steamboat Museum where these rather magnificent works of art were being conserved, and young people were being trained to conserve these boats. The boat museum at the time was really unprepossessing. It was really in a sorry shape. But we began our design process as detectives and started to look at the various histories of the site and to sort of augment those into a design process and somehow find form that made sense of buildings that were around the lake shore. One of the incredible things that we were really transfixed about when we first came to the Steamboat Museum was the fact that it was so unique that the lake was actually drawn into the centre of the museum. This was such a magical kind of component of the museum. And we thought that these raw, unself-conscious industrial forms were really quite beautiful in their own right. And we looked to some of the photography of the Bechers from the Dusseldorf School of Photography, and their serial photography of industrial typologies, and actually kind of identifying certain beauty in the kind of the raw industrial architecture that wasn't kind of designed with any sense of kind of beauty or anything other than its purpose for working in mind. And we looked to more recent architectures that were in and around Lake Windermere, on the lake shore, Voisey, early 20th century architect, quite radical at the time, was building these rather incredible residential projects, rather typologically English and expressive of what a roof wants to do in this landscape. But also we found, this idea of the kind of topographical change of, topographical change, building a house on a, building a house on top of a kind of a change in topography, and that was given figure in the landscape. And then these really special, quite radical at the time, overhanging forms, both in spaces carved out from the building, the form of the building itself, but also from the overhang of the roofs. We really look to these kind of high-minded architects' work of the early 20th century, but also to the kind of workaday industrial buildings. And we looked quite forensically about how you would build a boathouse on the lake. This will be a museum for boats on the lake, and this seems to be typologically the most sensible thing to do when you make a boathouse on the lake. You have a hard standing where the dry stone wall is built off of. You have a steeply pitched roof, and then you have some timber doors to secure your boat that gets taken into the museum and stored and put away safely. Now, this side of the construction will last a long time. This side of the construction will probably last only a few years. So that there's very, very conscious awareness of what architectural elements, how they behave, what they can do in the landscape, and how you make architecture that sort of makes sense of this climate, but this culture as well. This is our first competition sketch. It's a very large museum. It's 3,500 square meters on footprint. And we thought, with our research into typological forms, with our research into buildings of a certain scale in the landscape, we wanted to break down the big museum into a cluster of forms. So you almost have the museum as a settlement. That was our original instinct. We didn't quite know what that meant at the time in terms of the form and the figure of these things, but then we started taking clues from these precedents that we researched and looking at kind of very normative, very normal, regular industrial or agricultural forms, and then somehow architecturally adapting them to make them special, and to acknowledge that the buildings in this place are enjoyed for being inside the museum, outside the museum, and perhaps this really rather special space that mediated the inside and the outside, this kind of buffer space between inside and outside, which was very, in a sense, very un-English until precedents like the Voysey house started to bring those into public consciousness. Once again, we look to the Voysey precedent of making this kind of plateau or acropolis of a level that comes out of the datum of the lake. We at the time were rather fond of this kind of magical boathouse in the center and wanted to cluster forms around it that somehow made sense of this kind of crowning element, the boathouse that brought water all the way into the center of the museum. And then gradually what emerged was this pattern of thinking about buildings orientated to water, and the buildings that created a very direct relationship between the visitor and water and boats and water, so that buildings started to frame views and that there was a walk around these buildings as though in a kind of coats-on experience. The building was just as good being outside or inside or somewhere in between. Once again, I'd like to reference another project that we were doing at the same time. This is an incredibly quick piece of research that we were fortunate to find a client to take a risk on this project. We built a 800 square meter restaurant on top of an incomplete car park, 35 meters in the air, in the middle of the biggest construction site in Europe, from first briefing to opening night in 10 weeks. So for less money than you would do a London terraced house extension project for a medium-sized family. It shouldn't really have happened, but we took the project on, and we worked very, very quickly with being very rigorous about what we could control, and that was aligning spaces to views, making architectural moves that were somehow intrinsically linking inside to outside in very specific ways. So I'll come back to this form in a second, but we, in early sketches, wanted this to break down a singular hall, which the client wanted us to put a wedding marquee on top of this car park. And we said, no, we can build this in a much more interesting way. What if we build it in a more granular way so that there are more interesting experiences for hospitality? It was a restaurant and a gallery as a function. And we built this kind of cluster of kind of small rooms that, once again, very early sketches about ideas about what's important, what is the spatial policy of the project. Well, actually, we didn't really know what the form of the project was, but we knew it would be made from temporary work, scaffolding poles. We knew we had to open a project within 10 weeks from the first brief. And we thought scaffolding boards, wooden boards and wooden poles would be good enough. So we built that. We lived in a scaffolder's yard for 4 weeks. We learned how to build with scaffolding, so we learned how to draw with scaffolding. We made some very large-scale models. We were laughed at by the scaffolders because we hadn't learned through 10, 15, 25 years of this trade. And they built us this rather magnificent creation that basically was proportioned around uncut scaffold boards and uncut scaffold poles that were lashed together, making a single dining room where all of the rooms confluenced in a single space in the middle. And they had a very special relationship to the perimeter. They had these very, very big windows that regarded these very big views. These are PVC curtains that you get, hygienic curtains you get at things like abattoirs, where you can just brush them to one side. There was no way we could ever get a window this big, so we had to be relaxed about the materials that we were using, because the architectural idea was about the space, and the space aggregated these various rooms that were organized to views and created this rather magical place, this form, which was a direct consequence of a synthesis of inside and outside of the building. So back to Windermere, you can sort of see some of the DNA of this idea of arranging architecture quite naturally to its context, arranging forms which have at their heart the building blocks of rooms, and arranging those in a site to somehow make sense of their own internal and external arrangement. And we arrived on this rather seemingly scattered plan, but actually they all had very precise relationships to the raison d'etre of this project, moving these big boats around the museum. So you can see that, whoops, forgive me. You can see that the boats on the water always face the building in one way. The boats are dragged up from the slipway, dragged around the site, and then face the water in a different way when they're in the museum. The whole building was set out with this idea of movement of these 40 metric ton objects around the site and creating the visitor experience around these. So the building has no front or back. It's, in a sense, all front. It has jetties from the water. It has a park from the land. And we came up with this spatial policy of, oops, sorry, this is quite sensitive, this cursor. Came up with this spatial policy of organising rooms to the water, rooms to the views. So we have these in the centre of each square form on plan. We have a nave that points towards the water. The entrance is the first building, which has a view down the wet dock where the water comes into the museum. We then go into the main exhibition hall, the conservators' workshop, onto the boatyard, into the wet dock, into a circulation space, an education space, and a cafe. Rather like the restaurant project, it has a kind of formal intention, but with more functional specificity that is giving personality to each one of the interiors of this building. But somehow it's described as a kind of overall cohesive whole and with one sculptural material. Now we wanted those forms to somehow make sense as a overall composition, but be given different figure with the different rooms inside them, and have very, very different sectional, spatial qualities. This is literally in the lake, and these are buildings that are hugging each side, which have these very dramatic, deliberately cantilevered forms where the structure of the main hall kind of dives outside, it's insulated, it carries a gutter. The gutter is not taken as a regular down pipe straight down, it's taken back into the building. And it creates these rather wonderful spaces beneath that are so poignant because they're functional, but they also frame views to the land and the water. We began by thinking this should be a stainless steel project because we thought we'd learnt so much in our 7th of July project, and then after working on the project through detailed design over 4 seasons, we realised nothing is stainless in this environment. So we opted to look for other qualities of materials. We looked farther afield to some of the Nordic architecture, and specifically we were fond of this building by Alvar Aalto, the Pensions Institute, for a number of reasons, because it as a material, it registers the passage of time. It registers some kind of cultural, environmental value in its surface, in the meaning of its making. But at the same time, we thought that it was interesting as cladding because it was made. It looked as though it was made from pieces. It wasn't warehouses that were. It could have been oh so easy to make this as kind of infinitely long pieces of profiled metal, but there was a very distinct architectural idea about humanizing the scale of the construction unit. So we elected to use natural copper in the end, and rather enjoyed the registration of the temporal qualities of this material in its surface, and by that I mean it shows the maker's marks. We're very interested in how things are made and showing how they're made, but also how they register use over time, how they register weather over time. This is a mock-up of all of the junctions within the project, brought very, very close together and built 3 years ago. So we're seeing this copper material that clearly, if it were any other material, it would have looked pretty much the same way in which it's patinated, but somehow this material venerates that kind of process of patination. So we're working in a very, very intense climate, very, very difficult to build in. But these forms are almost complete, and these are some completion shots that we're going to launch the project in a month or 2. It's a very, very difficult climate to build in. As I say, the lake is 4 degrees centigrade. there's people that have been working over the winter in the lake for 8 hours a day welding slipways to bring boats in off the water. But we're starting to get these rather magnificent forms that just have quite a still, ambiguous presence in the landscape. What we rather enjoy is when one looks at these forms, you think they might be an agricultural building or an industrial building, and yet they're made special by somehow this ever so slightly adjusted tension in the form, and that they have a very specific tension between the buildings themselves. At points, the buildings almost kiss in plan form, but are spaced apart in 3 dimensions because of the pavilion, the plinth. They're made remarkable because they don't have concrete roads going up to the front door. They have slate waste. It's very, very textural. The whole idea of using materials, and these buildings will really patinate into these incredible kind of hues of browns and greens eventually, which will embed them in their context, and which is really what we wanted them to do. And you get these most incredible moments where the form of the building, even in its incomplete form, is actually deliberately cantilevering over a small river to bring more focus to some of those things that you may passively overlook on a trip to the Lake District. It's an intensification of this moment where you're passing from land to water. We use physical models all the time in our practice to test ideas and to discuss with clients how architecture should kind of come to being. This is a rather poor snap of the same architectural intention of the foyer, framing a view into the wet dock and further onto the lake. And there's this rather incredible space emerging of this barn over the lake itself, and the water is physically coming all the way into the building, where the boats will be stored in their most venerable position. It's best to see a boat on water. All the time, through our experience of building the temporary buildings, we built some temporary conservators' sheds, so the conservation program could take place during the making of the building, and this is what the conservators are going to be moving into, a purpose-built space that is lined with scaffold planks. We learnt are so robust from our Studio East dining project, and then we have some more kind of high-minded exhibition spaces which will keep some of the Turner watercolour paintings and some of the more fragile steamboats. But the architecture is coming together in really kind of interesting ways, and that this ensemble of buildings really kind of we believe is really befitting with the kind of the lake, the lateral kind of lake and the hillsides, and you get these kind of ambiguous figures that are coming together and somehow signing perhaps more of a portico as a public building, somehow signing an industrial building that leads onto a boatyard, but all as one they make coherent sense, and eventually over time they will become kind of quite background figures in the landscape. I want to just talk a little bit about some of the teaching that we've been doing as a studio. As we did a course in Stuttgart University where we made only models for teaching master's students. This is a artist studio. This is a 1:10 model taken from inside and the back of the same model, but just showing really the importance of thinking through making and then recording the atmospheric effects of physical things, the presence of physical things, and designing through making physical things. This next project I'd like to talk about is for some artist studios, and we've done a lot of projects with artists, and they see the world in very specific ways. They're very they have a very precise visual acuity. They're very the artists that we've worked with have very precise interests in the world of things and the visual world, and I think they've focused our attention on things, those architects that sometimes we overlook. But this particular project is making a sort of workshop for artists and really making architecture as not the kind of foreground of a museum, but the background of somewhere to work and as an artist kind of examine things and exhibit things and really make spaces that are conducive to making artwork. And sometimes those environments are really quite unassuming. Sometimes those environments are really anonymous and are given figure by really ordinary things like a great window for a view. And sometimes they're given figure by windows that just want to bring light into spaces, because windows are not for view, they're just for bringing a modulated quality of daylight into a more privatized world, so that more private work can be done creatively. This is a studio for Julian Opie in East London, and what's really fantastic is Julian we had a really enriched conversation about working in this kind of Victorian London warehouse culture and debating what would be the authentic way of making a new warehouse. Well, actually, you probably wouldn't build a brick warehouse with punched holes in the wall, and Julian didn't want punched holes in the wall. He wanted daylight to be brought into the top, because there was a hotel being built right next door on the other side of this 3-meter wide alley, which prevented him from doing private work. So as an artist who can bring such an interesting abstraction to a brief, it gives us the license as architects to be a bit more liberal in form than perhaps some of this kind of figurative architecture of the 19th century. It just works as an interesting counterpoint in that sense. The artist studio project that I'd like to actually talk about, that those investigations have influenced, is at Park Hill in Sheffield. This is our site. You can tell this is a remarkable figure on the landscape. In the 1960s, this is one of the largest buildings in post-war reconstructed Britain, and it remains today to be the biggest listed building in the whole of Europe. It's 954 residential apartments built on the most incredible topography, which slopes from the top of the site to the bottom of the site over 8 stories, and you get this datum where the buildings have the same top and they just get deeper. So they have this very, very particular relationship of the grid, the modernist kind of Corbusian ideals taken from projects like Unité, and crashing them into a very unusual topography, creating this kind of wall around the estate, but these kind of gardens, this park within the estate, and that these were homes for 954 people, families, until the early 2000s, when they fell into disrepair. But this was a really kind of enlivened place with playgrounds and shops and public civic facilities within the centre of this plan, and that there was very sort of optimistic modernism in the figure of the landscape and the architecture itself. You'll remember I said about the the housing blocks actually getting deeper as the topography goes down the hill. Well, actually, one of the architect's original ideas, which is both the success and failure of the project ultimately, were these streets in the skies where you could literally drive a milk delivery truck from the landscape and pretend as though these were like the figure of kind of streets, or the confluence were miniature squares. They were trying to play with the typology, the figure of houses and streets and squares, but in an altogether abstract way. In the early 2000s, that sort of dream had kind of evaporated, and with much more deeply embedded social problems, economic problems in the city, then the housing project just sort of failed. It was taken back by the council, repossessed, and gradually taken back to its kind of raw form. Our project is as part of a holistic renovation of the entire site of Park Hill, most of which will be mixture of social and owner-occupier residential, but our project will be artist studios. So, rather we look to incredible projects like Palais de Tokyo by Lacaton or Vassal, just kind of taking the raw majesty of found space and repurposing it for creative use, and not being too precious about the precision or the polish, the varnish of the finish. Our client is an arts charity, and they worked in a warehouse collectively together. They produced art in a big, slack, singular space. And our conundrum, our dilemma in designing new spaces for these artists is to imagine how they're going to come from this type of space to these kind of space, which are stacked and cellularized. And once again, we're at the stage where we're becoming detectives about what the building wants the studios to be and what the studios wants the building to be. But we're examining, the structure in its fundamental form, and looking at the rules of the game of the existing building, making very, very large models, very intensive speculations about how certain pieces of the structure can be retained, where we put new interventions into the facade, how we upgrade the thermal fabric, and how certain parts of the building become used in different ways, in not only kind of single-story apartments or studios, but we start to be a bit more spatially investigative about how to use the matrix of these studios, so that there are spaces to make small work and there are spaces to make large work simultaneously. So by taking out elements of the frame, we get this incredible complexity within the found spaces of the existing buildings, and all we're doing really is crafting those spaces from the original matrix and making a thermal environment and just putting a good padlock on the front door. That, artists don't really need that much more than that. But then we started to talk amongst ourselves and with the client about what are the needs of artists beyond just their place of work, their place of creative production, and they need to be connected to other artists for creative exchange. So we think it's really, really important that some larger spaces are quarried from this matrix, this structural frame, and that there are spaces that are breathing light and air deep into working spaces and showing spaces. And we've got these courtyard gardens, which are social spaces and exhibition spaces, which we derived from a very early project, a temporary project once again for Frieze Art Fair. We did 10,000 square meters of tents and some recreational spaces that were literally pushed outside of the art tents and under the tree canopies, making models, iterating with models, making physical forms, making temporary buildings that are only designed to last 3 or 4 days, but working with physical form and looking at how to create inventive architecture from only 2 or 3 components, but using the geometry of the materials themselves, but a conciliation of their context, and focusing on very special ways on landscape, creating these courtyard gardens and making spectacles that you might ordinarily overlook. So this is really, where we're taking the project at the moment, into embedding showing spaces and working spaces into the landscape and threading landscape in between, breathing light and air into these buildings, and always having a connection to physical landscape experiences, to nature. So when you're looking at art in one space, there's a sort of enfilade of views through the project, and even to further views to frame Park Hill as a piece of cityscape in the background, so that this is a totally different conciliation of room and function for showing art gallery space to spaces for working. This is the last project I'm going to show, but once again, before I get properly into the project, I just wanted to show the very first project that Kevin Carmody and I ever worked on. This was in 2005. This is the first model we made, and it's sort of a project in Kevin's home country in Australia, deep in the into the countryside in Australia, some 3 hours from the nearest city. It's some wool processing sheds. And our project in front, which was this kind of very, very simple shelter, which remediated the inside spaces of the wool processing sheds, which were made for film studios, and the outside landscape. So people worked on lived on the edges of the shadows. So this topic of territory and shelter and environmental protection has always been really a central conversation to what we're doing in the studio. This is one of our latest projects. You may recognize this drawing from Charles Rennie Mackintosh. We're making a rather remarkable temporary museum to sheathe the whole of the Rennie Mackintosh's Hill House as it's repaired over the next 15 years. The project is in just 30 kilometres northwest of Glasgow, in a town called Helensburgh, on a gridiron pattern, and right at the top of this townscape is Charles Rennie Mackintosh's Hill House. It has an incredible context, this place. It is both dormitory town, residential, luxury kind of suburbs for the early 19th century industrialists, overlooking the industrial heartland of the Clyde, shipbuilding and steel making, what have you. This is a house that has an incredible relationship with its landscape. It is not only an incredibly progressive piece of architecture in its own right. It's a very austere piece of architecture from the outside. It's a very unusual piece of architecture because in its solid form, it somehow brings in Scottish baronial traditional castle architecture, but references some of the some of the cutting-edge kind of modernism of Vienna and of Southern Europe at the time. And it has an incredibly radical approach to making a plan. It's one of the houses, well, it's probably one of the most important residential buildings in modern buildings in the UK. It influenced architects such as Louis Kahn on his served and serviced spaces ideas. But it has this, you would normally expect the front door of the house to be on the principal elevation. Here we have the front door on the minor elevation. We have this very radical L-shaped plan with this very unusual spatial unveiling of a sequence, a route around the house, and where furniture in these poches makes very unusual rooms within the room. It's incredibly spatially progressive and decoratively a complete piece of work. The hand block wallpaper and the fireplaces and the lamps and the chairs, even the textiles were designed by Mackintosh. But today it's in a rather poor state of repair, and it's in a poor state of repair because of the way Charles Rennie Mackintosh originally built this project. He was making this as a sort of a very a brave experiment, not only in terms of language of architecture at the time in 1904, but also in terms of construction technology. And he was borrowing techniques from Southern Europe of concrete render, but applying those to sandstone, which concrete render has split in the cold weather. Water has got in, but now it can't get out. So the building is rotting from the inside out. And some of those details that are so kind of typological of Mackintosh's architecture, the abstract kind of parapets with no stone dressings, the image of the architecture is both the success and ultimate failure of this house. And this is how we find the interiors of the house now. As a visitor experience, it has buckets of dripping water. And the client ran an international competition to put an enclosure over the house and design a visitor's pavilion beside it whilst the Hill House was being repaired, resuscitated, renovated, conserved. And we've done scaffolding projects. This is Castle Drogo, which has been done in a similar way. And we just thought scaffolding is the wrong thing to do for this project, because we know the limits of this technology, because we've made a prototype of this kind of architecture, and it would literally suffocate. With the volume of scaffolding around it, you would literally suffocate the Hill House for 15 years. You would never see it again. And so we've come up with an alternative, which, an alternative which creates a rather more shrink-wrapped, thin crust around the Hill House, and wraps the pavilion, which was the original intention of the competition, to be an object within the enclosure of this larger wrap, and that we create the most absolutely delicate structure that we can for so many reasons, so that we can see to and from the house, but also that it has a very, very delicate footprint on the landscape. It doesn't threaten or destabilize the existing landscape whilst we're doing the project repairs. We looked at Cedric Price and those imaginative kind of projects that are more sort of infrastructural than architectural, that embrace the idea of adaptive change over the lifespan of the building, and see the building rather more mechanistically as an apparatus for getting people to enjoy different experiences within the overall volume. So we have three real three or four real components to this project now. We have the big box, we have the steel frame, and we have what we're calling the museum inside, and the Charles Rennie Mackintosh's Hill House is one ship in a bottle exhibit in this museum, as is the temporary visitors centre, and that really there is a much more integrated visitor experience into the conservatorial process of mending this house than there would have been if it was just put in a scaffold jacket, and that there's a visitor route that can literally experience the full volume of the house, which takes its clues from earlier projects, early experiments, early prototypes that we did as a young studio, where we did walkways outside the British Museum to get you up to different levels of the city, to be able for you to examine the city in different ways and take different experiences, have different social experiences, have different cultural experiences of the place by affording you, even for a short point of time, that different vantage. So the project is coming together as this apparatus, I hope that's visible on the plan, where you come into a small visitor centre which discharges you axially into the ground floor of the plan that I spoke about before, but then uses the crust of the building as a visitor experience that becomes a sequence of ramps up and over the entire house that is built, once again, we need to build with economy of means, we need to build quickly, we need to build delicately. So we were looking to looking to technologies that build pylons, galvanized steel bolted together. And we were looking also to the figure of what that structural technique became as an architecture. And that you get this rather interesting counterpoint of the limits of transparent architecture. It can't really communicate as it's kind of as solid architecture can do, in our opinion. But it can be a really vivid apparatus for providing a visitor experience when this 15 years of dry shelter is required to conserve this building. So the roof will do most of the work, and then a foil of stainless steel chainmail, I believe the largest piece of stainless steel chainmail in the world, will attenuate the rain but give this really beautiful view to and from the house, so that the house can still be visible from the landscape. Bees can still get in and pollinate the landscape inside the house, and people get an altogether different perspective of this conservation and ponder the meaning of modern conservation. What are we doing and why we're doing it for the entire length of the time it takes to conserve this hill house. The little visitor centre, just as a nod to the kind of high contrast light and dark chiaroscuro architecture of the Mackintosh interiors, and just places key architectural relationships between the new interior of the visitor centre and the axis of the front door of the house, and that somehow architecture is, as far as our project is concerned, simply another experimental prototype that can help us make sense of our times. Thank you very much indeed.
Ringraziamo Andy Groarke per la bellissima lezione, e ora, come consuetudine, apriamo lo spazio delle domande, e fate pure la domanda in italiano e io penserò a tradurla all'architetto.
Allora, nella presentazione appunto l'architetto parlava dell'utilizzo dei modelli come un mezzo fondamentale per lo studio dello spazio da progettare. Io volevo sapere, ora a grandi linee ovviamente, se quando si approccia ad un nuovo progetto, la prima idea, ecco, che viene fuori nel dover elaborare un modello predilige la vista che avrà il visitatore dall'esterno o piuttosto una percezione spaziale degli interni.
I would say models are incredibly important to our studio for a number of reasons. First of all, whatever scale, they are physical. They're not a drawing or a rendering like this, which will tell you from one point of view how to understand the design idea. I think with a model, you can have many different points of view and many different opinions about the meaning of a physical thing. Because Kevin and I run jointly a design studio, we think that it's incredibly important to use a variety of methods of design, but models are the most important because they're very democratic. They sort of deauthorize a design process and allow many people to contribute even in the physical making of the project. In terms of at what scale we begin on making a model, the way we approach it from several different scales. I think ultimately good architecture is a conciliation of the room and the context, the city. Architecture is that kind of cartilage in between that links those two realms. The room, it places inhabitation at the core of the experience of architecture, but it's also a conciliation of how architecture belongs to place in its surroundings. In our teaching in Stuttgart, we did a very non-linear model-making process. The models that I showed you deliberately began the entire semester with 1 to 10 as a scale. That was the first project. So bringing from the students' very own personal experiences, they found it really quite easy to, at close quarters, to make very, very rich architectural decisions about a design. We then, in our Stuttgart program, went to the scale of the city, 1 to 2,500, 1 to 500, and left the architectural scale out. We came back to the architectural scale at the end, and what was very interesting is it was easy to piece those two together because the students had gained such an intense attitude towards how to make rooms and what to do from a policy point of view at city level and how to relate city to room and vice versa, that making architecture as this kind of in-between step came much more quickly than they tell me than they were used to, because they've been examining it from both those points of view. In our studio, in our professional work, we do work on. We always begin with the city, the site. We always begin a site model. We always deliberately slow the process of design down, so that we can see the model emerging, the physical thing emerging, and we can take time to think about the design as it's being made, if only in context, and then we iterate really rather quickly, very, very kind of rough, quick models. We don't make presentation models very often. All the models in the studio are presentation models as far as we're concerned, because everyone is involved in the design and making, and everyone is involved in the discussion of the models. So they're really invaluable at several different scales to talk with ourselves as directors, as designers, as editors of the practice's creative output, They're good for young students, graduates to learn craft of making things and jointing things and having an attitude about design through making. And they're really good to communicate conversations with people that aren't familiar with looking at drawings. They're incredibly intensive things. They take a long time, but they're really incredibly valuable in the process. And if you can't make it at scale, you definitely can't make it in real life.
Grazie, io volevo chiedere, sono molto interessata a quest'ultimo progetto perché è particolarmente utopistico, volevo sapere se è un concorso oppure se sarà realizzato, se insomma, il progetto avrà una continuazione.
This project goes on site 2 months' time. It's fully funded, it has planning permission, it has the full support of the client, the National Trust for Scotland. It is a fully invested project with Strathclyde University and Glasgow University and the Building Research Establishment on how to do modern conservation techniques on this historic building. I think the client is really pushing, really being very brave with this project to examine our responsibility to conservation in a very radical way, and at the same time to do it in a way that people can visit and be part of that conversation about conservation.
My question concerns another part of the design process. You were showing us a lot of projects that involves a very straight link or even a merge with existing elements or existing buildings. And I would like to talk about materials.
Yes.
Like, I would like to have some more information about your process of choosing materials.
Yeah.
In a lot of your projects, transparency is very important, for example, and you're always talking about different ways of approaching problems with different materials. So I imagine that there is a very long process and a very deep study about selecting, trying materials. And I would like to know exactly how this happened and also when this happened in your projects.
It happens from day one on every project. I think all of the projects, I think a successful project in the studio is a conciliation between an urban idea, a spatial idea, and a constructive idea. I just want to return to the studio shot just a second. I think that each project has its own common denominator of problem. I think you can't build a project like the temporary restaurant gallery that I have on the screen here. If you've only got 10 weeks, you can't build that in situ concrete or rammed earth or brick or wet trades. And so I think there's a certain methodology between the time scale of the project. There's a certain methodology between the expression of the material. I wouldn't say it's always truth to materials. I think sometimes I think buildings need to speak in slightly different ways than just be just purely tectonic. I'm just rewinding back to our studio shot. We experiment a lot with materials in different ways. We may make our whole design studio out of plywood. We may make a whole house out of brick, and be completely uncompromising in the sculptural abstraction of learning about one material and its tectonic techniques and its embedded cultural messages of craft and the meaning of its making. I think it's, we don't, I wouldn't say wouldn't say our projects search for a certain transparency. I think some of the projects today have kind of perhaps more lightweight qualities than some of the other projects I could have shown you, but I wanted to show you projects that have a deliberately distorted timescale in their gestation and their making, so that, you know, when we make some of those pavilions that they may take a week to make, and they're only around for 3 days, you know, we consider those in themselves as one-to-one models, and we consider those as a privilege to be commissioned to make an enormous model. And then it makes you think, when you reference back the Lutyens memorial, well, do you outweigh the more long-lasting or the more permanent just because do you give that more value? And I've come to think that they each have their own validity, and it's important to be in the presence of physical architecture to understand its proper qualities. And the materials of some of the projects that we've shown you today, they have a dramatic difference, make a dramatic difference on the atmosphere of spaces and places, the acoustic of spaces, the smell of places, the warmth, the temperature, the humidity. They all make a very atmospheric contribution, and people respond very emotionally to these things. So these very short-lived projects are really interesting anthropological experiments into spaces and materials and form, and how people behave around them and use them and misuse them. That some of them are successful failures because of them. You know, we learn because we have the opportunity to build very, very quickly in those situations. Some of the more long-lasting projects become more sober in character and have to use more traditionally tectonic materials, and have to detail them in a way where the grammar of the architecture has to respond more to their environment and how to make them last longer. Does that answer your question? Yeah?
Between everything you've talked about, one of the most common themes was how much time will a piece of a project will last. How important for you is a building's timelessness?
How important for me is...
Or how do you approach that?
I think it's incredibly important. Not only are there are simple pragmatic, economic, environmental criteria to building quickly. I think you have a duty to anything that you do as an architect to consider what happens at the end of its lifespan. Or, I mean, there's no real such thing as a permanent building. There's components of any building that will eventually fail and have to be replaced. So I guess those projects have taught us different value judgments about, you know, how long a building will last, and whether we do a building that can, at the end of its lifespan, have another purpose, which we've actually recycled our own temporary projects for other temporary projects, because frankly they're the best things to use for other projects in that brief. But you know, often we've been confronted with the question of, if we can't reuse them, then how do we throw them away well? You know, we have a duty to the environment, because anything that we do as architects, you know, relatively speaking, is a violation of natural resources and certain environments of some description. So we have to be as responsible in weighing up that duty as we possibly can.
In the project about the memorial,
yes,
you've said you've been in the competition with various sculptures.
Yes.
At what point do you believe that you can remove functions from a piece of architecture and it's still an architecture and not just a sculpture? Where's the fine line?
I think that's a very good question. I think that's one of the questions we were confronting all the way through the design of this memorial. Were we being architects, or were we somehow working beyond the margins legitimately of our practical or social art or craft? I think that the one thing that we did reassure ourselves on was that we were not making form for form's sake. We were making a very architectural process of consulting with a client about their needs. Their needs were representative, effectively, to create a place. We were dealing with issues of a conciliation of brief and dealing with a context. I think that is a very architectural study, and I think ultimately architecture is very representative. It cannot help but be representative. It cannot help but mean things to people through the realm of experience. And so I think, you know, it's 52 columns. It's abstract architecture. It doesn't quite have all of the functionality of conventional architecture of shelter and comfort. But I'm still okay that it's an architectural work.
Solo una piccola curiosità, se ci puoi descrivere un po' la tua esperienza con David Chipperfield, dove hai lavorato per gli studenti.
So I worked in David Chipperfield's office in, gosh, when would it be, 1998 to about 2003. That's where Kevin Carmody and I met, and it was where we learned an enormous amount working for David on architecture, its methodology, how you work with models, how you work with physical things, how to give meaning to space and form, how the relationship between space and form and material works, or can be manipulated, and what are the limits of that. We enjoyed some incredible client relationships during that period as well. We worked on Anthony Gormley's studio, sculptor, famous, world-renowned British sculptor, and he was forensically interested in materials and how materials found their form, and how even at a chemical composition, the comprehension of material characteristics could configure the form of an entire building. Actually, the way you made not only a window frame, a handrail, a staircase, but what the meaning of materials, whether they were mineral or organic or inorganic, what form that they would naturally find, and what expression you could, as a sculptor in his case and as an architect in our cases, what meaning you could what were the limits of those, the rules inherent within those materials that could actually give kind of figure to form. So I think we had some incredible opportunities to work on built projects and work on a lot of competitions, both in the UK and overseas, and to think, to understand how some architects are just so agile to maneuver into different cultural situations and enable are enabled to think like foreigners but still build like locals. I think that's something that I learnt an awful lot from working at David's office.
Se non ci sono ultime domande, ripensamenti dell'ultimo secondo, possiamo congedarci qui. Vi ringrazio tutti quanti di essere venuti e di aver partecipato anche quest'anno. E ringraziamo ancora Andy Groarke per la bellissima lezione.
Thank you.
E alla prossima. Grazie a tutti.